A man murders 9 women, possibly 17. He is caught, he is convicted, he goes to prison for the rest of his life. Justice is served. Now imagine a group of politicians sitting in a comfortable chamber somewhere, voting to give that man another shot at walking out. That is not a hypothetical. That is what is happening right now in the state of New York. Serial killer Joel Rifkin, a man who strangled between 9 and 17 women and disposed of their bodies across Long Island, could be eligible for parole under legislation that New York lawmakers are currently pushing through the system. Him, eligible for parole. And Rifkin is just the beginning. Mass shooter Peyton Gendron, who live-streamed himself massacring 10 people at a grocery store in a black neighborhood in Buffalo, could eventually walk out too. Colin Ferguson, who opened fire on a packed commuter train on the Long Island Railroad and killed 6 people, wounded 19 more. Same story. These are the people New York politicians are fighting for right now, and they are calling it reform. If nobody in your life is telling you this, that is exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe right now, because what you are about to hear is one of the most infuriating stories in American politics today, and you deserve to know every detail. This is National Briefing. We don't soften this stuff. We lay it out straight. Let's go. All right, I want to take a breath here and set the table properly, because this story has a lot of layers to it, and I want to make sure you understand every single one of them by the time we're done. We're going to walk through 4 specific bills that are working their way through the New York State Legislature right now. We're going to talk about what each one does in plain English, no legal jargon, and we're going to talk about who it benefits. We're going to hear from the people who are fighting hardest against these bills: law enforcement, prosecutors, and the families of murder victims who are watching this unfold with absolute horror. And we're going to ask the question that nobody in Albany seems to want to answer. Whose side are you actually on? Because that is what this comes down to. It always does. When you look at a piece of legislation, when you strip away the flowery language and the political framing, the question you have to ask is simple. Who does this help? And who does this hurt? These 4 bills help murderers, rapists, serial killers, and mass shooters. And they hurt every single victim, every single family member, every single law-abiding citizen who trusted the system to protect them. That's not my characterization. That is the documented, specific, on-the-record assessment of prosecutors, county officials, and victims' families in New York. And we are going to give them the floor today. Let's start from the top. These pieces of legislation have been grouped together under a label that Suffolk County officials are now calling the 4 bad bills. And that name is doing a lot of work, because each one of these bills on its own would be a serious problem. Together, they represent a fundamental transformation of how New York handles its most violent criminals. The bills have official names, and those names are important because the names are designed to make you feel good about them. The Earned Time Act, the Fair and Timely Parole Act, the Elder Parole Bill, the Second Look Act. Read those names again: earned time, fair and timely, elder parole, second look. Now ask yourself, who came up with those names? And what were they trying to make you feel when you heard them? Because earned time sounds reasonable. It sounds like accountability. It sounds like inmates working hard and being rewarded for good behavior. Fair and timely parole sounds like due process, like making sure nobody is trapped in the system longer than they should be. Elder parole sounds compassionate. Elderly people in prison, maybe nonviolent, maybe sick, maybe no longer a threat. And a second look sounds like wisdom, like making sure we didn't get it wrong. None of those names tell you what these bills actually do. So let's do that. Let's look at each one and strip the language down to the truth. We'll start with the Earned Time Act, because in some ways, this is the most immediately explosive of the 4. Here's what it does in plain language. It cuts all sentences, every sentence that is less than a life sentence, in half. 50% off. If you were sentenced to 40 years, congratulations, you might be looking at 20. If you got 30 years, now it's 15. Across the board, retroactively. That word is doing an enormous amount of work here, and I want to make sure you don't miss it. This is not a change that applies going forward to people who commit crimes after the law passes. This applies to people who are already in prison, people who were sentenced under the laws that existed at the time of their crimes, people whose victims and whose victims' families were told, he got 40 years, he'll serve 40 years. And now the state is going back and quietly rewriting that deal. Think about what that means for Teresa Bliss. She's a mother from Suffolk County whose 25-year-old son David was murdered in 2021 outside a pizzeria, shot to death after an argument with strangers. Her son was 25 years old. He had his whole life in front of him, and it was taken from him in an instant. The man who shot him received a sentence of 40 years to life in prison. 40 years. Under the Earned Time Act, parole could come dramatically sooner, much sooner. And Teresa Bliss would have to live with that, with the knowledge that the system promised her one thing and delivered another. She showed up at a news briefing this week and said something that I think every lawmaker in Albany needs to hear. She said, "When you pass laws that prioritize criminals over victims, you're not reforming the system. You're erasing us." Erasing us. Those are two words that carry the weight of everything, because that is exactly what this feels like to victims' families. They went through the worst thing a human being can go through. They sat through trials. They gave victim impact statements. They watched verdicts come down. They built some kind of fragile peace around the knowledge that the person who destroyed their lives was going to pay for it with decades behind bars. And now somebody in Albany wants to rewrite that sentence retroactively without asking them. But there's more to this bill. Because it also, and this part is almost unbelievable, prevents prison assaults and stabbings from being deducted from credits for good behavior. Read that again. If an inmate attacks a guard, if they stab someone inside the prison, that assault cannot be used to reduce their good behavior credits. In other words, violence committed behind bars has no meaningful consequence under this bill when it comes to earning early release. You cannot earn your way out faster, but you also cannot lose your progress by being violent. That is the system this bill creates. And Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney summed it up as clearly as it can be summed up when he said about the people currently in prison. These people are where they are because they richly deserve it. Every second of whatever sentence they receive, they've earned. I want to stop here for a moment because I think some of you might be thinking, okay, but don't some people deserve a second chance? Isn't the whole point of the justice system rehabilitation? Isn't keeping people locked up forever expensive? Aren't there people in prison who don't belong there? And those are fair questions. They deserve honest answers. Yes, there are people in the prison system who were wrongly convicted. Yes, there are people serving sentences that don't fit their crimes. Yes, the system has real problems and real inequities that deserve real reform. But here's the question you have to ask when you look at these specific bills. Who do they actually help? Not the wrongly convicted. There are separate legal mechanisms for that. Appeals, post-conviction review, innocence projects. Those paths exist. These bills help Joel Rifkin. They help Peyton Gendron. They help Colin Ferguson. They help the man who shot David Bliss and then on home security camera footage shortly after the murder was caught laughing about it. That's who benefits, and that has to be part of the conversation. Let's keep going. The second bill is called the Fair and Timely Parole Act, and the name is designed to sound like a procedural fix, like we're just making the parole process run more efficiently, more fairly. What it actually does is fundamentally change what parole boards are allowed to consider when deciding whether to release someone. Right now, when a parole board evaluates an inmate, they look at the whole picture. Who is this person? What did they do? How have they behaved in prison? Do they show remorse? Have they accepted responsibility? And critically, what was the original crime? How serious was it? How violent was it? What was the impact on the victims? All of that goes into the decision. Under the Fair and Timely Parole Act, the parole board would be blocked from considering the nature of the original crime when making their decision. No matter how horrible, no matter how horrible. You cannot factor in that the person in front of you tortured and killed 8 women. You cannot factor in that they massacred 10 people at a grocery store. You cannot factor in that they went onto a commuter train and executed 6 people in front of terrified passengers. None of that. The crime itself, the thing that put them in prison, becomes legally irrelevant to the board deciding whether to let them out. District Attorney Tierney called this bill what it is. It turns parole upside down because that's exactly what it does. Parole has always been something you earn, something you demonstrate you deserve through your behavior, your rehabilitation, your demonstrated understanding of the harm you caused. This bill implies that parole is automatic, that it is a right, not a privilege, that the default is release, not continued incarceration. And here's the most chilling specific detail in this entire bill. Remember the man who shot David Bliss, the one caught on camera laughing about it right after the murder? Under this bill, if he comes up for parole, the board cannot consider that footage, cannot consider the fact that he showed zero remorse. In fact, showed the exact opposite of remorse in the immediate aftermath of killing a 25-year-old outside a pizza place. The laughing doesn't count. The callousness doesn't count. The demonstrated absence of any human feeling about what he did doesn't count. Tell that to Teresa Bliss. The third bill is the one that arguably has gotten the most attention. And for good reason, because this is the one that could, in the words of prosecutors, abolish life without parole in the state of New York. The bill establishes what's called elder parole. The idea, as it's being sold, is that elderly prisoners, people who are old, possibly sick, no longer physically dangerous, should have a pathway to get out of prison. And I want to be real with you here. In the abstract, there is a version of that argument that has some merit. A 90-year-old man dying of cancer in a prison cell is a policy question with legitimate debate around it, but that is not what this bill is. New York's version of elder parole would apply to any inmate who has served at least 15 years of any sentence, including a life sentence, and is over the age of 55. 15 years. That means Peyton Gendron, the white supremacist who live-streamed himself massacring 10 people at a top supermarket in Buffalo, will be eligible for elder parole consideration the moment he turns 55 years old. He is currently in his early 20s. Do the math. He's not going to be waiting very long in the grand scheme of a life sentence. And when that day comes, the families of his 10 victims, the families of people who were just shopping for groceries, who were gunned down on camera, whose deaths were treated as content by the man who killed them, those families are going to have to show up to parole hearings every 2 years, indefinitely. District Attorney Tierney asked the question directly. Once he turns 55, every 2 years, those families are going to have to go through the parole process again. Why? Why? That's the question. What is the policy goal that is worth putting those families through that? What is being achieved by forcing the survivors of a racially motivated mass murder to spend decades of their lives fighting to keep the man who killed their loved ones behind bars? And it's not just Gendron. Joel Rifkin, the Long Island serial killer who murdered between 9 and 17 women, would be eligible. Colin Ferguson, who killed 6 people on a commuter train, would be eligible. These are people who received life sentences because juries of their peers, weighing all of the evidence, decided that the crimes they committed were so severe, so irredeemable, so destructive to human life that they forfeited their right to ever walk free again. Life without parole exists for a reason. It is reserved for the worst of the worst. It is society's way of saying, this is a line you cannot come back from. This bill erases that line. Now, here's the thing. The politicians pushing these bills have talking points. They always do. And I want to address a couple of them directly because you're going to hear them and you deserve to have the full picture. One argument you'll hear is that mass incarceration is expensive and that the state would save money by releasing elderly prisoners who are no longer dangerous. Okay. First of all, the premise that a convicted serial killer or mass shooter is no longer dangerous because they turned 55 is worth examining seriously. Joel Rifkin is not dangerous because he's physically strong enough to overpower someone. He's dangerous because of who he is, what he's shown himself to be capable of, and what he did to 9, maybe 17 human beings. Age doesn't change that record. Second, and I say this as directly as I can, the cost of incarceration is not a morally sufficient argument for releasing people who committed mass murder. The families of victims paid a cost that no dollar figure can capture. That has to be part of the accounting. The other argument you'll hear is that the current system is racist and that these reforms are about racial equity. And here is where I want to be very careful and very honest. Racial disparities in the criminal justice system are real. They are documented. They are a serious problem that deserves serious policy attention. But the answer to racial inequity in the justice system is not to release Joel Rifkin. It is not to give Peyton Gendron, a white supremacist who specifically targeted black people, a path to freedom. These bills do not fix systemic racial inequity. They give blanket benefits to the most violent offenders in the system, regardless of race, and they do it at the expense of victims. Real reform looks like fixing the front end of the system, policing, prosecution, sentencing guidelines, not opening the back door for the worst people we've ever put away, the fourth bill, the Second Look Act. This one allows felons, any felon, convicted of any crime, to petition a court for a reduction in their sentence. And on the surface, again, that might sound reasonable. People deserve access to the courts. Systems make mistakes. Circumstances change. But let's look at the details, because the details are where you find the truth. Under the Second Look Act, there is no limit on the number of petitions an inmate can file, none. And there is no waiting period between petitions. If a judge denies your request, you can immediately file another one with a different judge. Let me make sure you're hearing that clearly. An inmate could have their petition denied on Monday and file a new one on Tuesday with a different judge, who has no connection to the original case and no relationship with the judge who just denied the petition. This is not a second look. This is an infinite number of looks with an ever-rotating cast of decision makers until you find the one who gives you the answer you want. And here is the other critical detail. The law specifically requires that the new petition go to a different judge than the one who originally sentenced the inmate. Not just a different judge than the one who denied the last petition, a different judge than the one who sentenced them to begin with. Why? What is the logic of that? The sentencing judge knows the case. They sat through the trial. They heard the evidence. They saw the victim impact statements. They made the decision for a reason. Under this bill, that knowledge and that history are specifically excluded from the process. The new judge comes in cold, looks at a petition, and makes a decision without the full context that produced the original sentence. Suffolk County Executive Edward Romaine did not mince words when he addressed this bill or any of the others. These bills are an insult to every law-abiding citizen, the law enforcement community, and especially the victims of these crimes, he said. Use common sense and do not pass these bills. Common sense. It's a phrase that keeps coming up in this conversation, and I think that's telling, because what's happening in Albany right now is a situation where common sense, the instinct that most normal people have about justice, about consequences, about what victims deserve, is being overridden by ideology. I want to step back from the policy details for a moment, because there's a danger in this kind of coverage of getting too deep into the legislative weeds and losing sight of what is actually at stake here. What is at stake here is people, real people. People who lived real lives and had those lives violently ended, and the families they left behind who have been forced to rebuild something out of the rubble, and who are now being told that the one thing they were promised, the one guarantee the system made to them, might be taken away. Teresa Bliss stood in front of cameras this week and spoke directly to the lawmakers pushing these bills. I have a question for every New York lawmaker pushing the Earned Time Act, Fair and Timely Parole Act, Elder Parole, and Second Look Act, she said. Does our pain mean anything to you? How do you fight so aggressively for the early release of murderers, yet dismiss the families whose lives were shattered? And then she said something that I think is the most important sentence anyone has said in this entire debate. The victims don't get second chances. The victims don't get second chances. David Bliss doesn't get a second look at his life. He doesn't get elder parole from death. He doesn't get to petition a court to walk back outside into the sunlight. He was 25 years old, and he was shot to death outside a pizzeria, and that is permanent. That is irreversible. And the man who did it was caught on camera laughing about it. The 10 people gunned down at the top supermarket in Buffalo don't get their lives back. Their families don't get the grief back. They don't get the funerals back, the birthdays that will never happen, the futures that were erased. 6 people on the Long Island Railroad, just commuters, just people going home from work, don't get another train ride, don't get to walk through their front doors and hug their families. These are the people the system is supposed to protect. These are the people whose voices are supposed to matter when legislators sit down to draft criminal justice policy. And when you listen to Teresa Bliss and you compare what she's saying to what the sponsors of these bills are saying, you have to ask yourself a very serious question. Where is the legislation for them? Where are the 4 bills protecting victims? Where is the Victims' Rights Restoration Act? Where is the No Second Chances for Serial Killers Act? Because right now, in the state of New York, there are 4 bills fighting hard for the interests of convicted murderers and violent felons. And the families of their victims showed up at a press conference to beg the people writing those bills to please consider their pain. That asymmetry is the story. Let's zoom out for a second and put this in its proper political context, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This is not the first time New York has moved in this direction. Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney has been one of the loudest and most consistent voices warning about the consequences of the state's criminal justice policy in recent years. And his warnings have not been theoretical. He has watched bail reform laws that were also packaged as reasonable, compassionate reforms, produce outcomes that nobody could reasonably defend. His office recently prosecuted a case involving 4 people suspected of dismembering a body and scattering the remains across Long Island's South Shore. Under the state's bail reform laws, those suspects were able to walk free before police had gathered enough evidence to charge them with the killing itself. Read that again. People suspected of dismembering a human body, walking free because the law required it. Tierney also made headlines earlier this month when he took an extraordinary step to work around New York's sanctuary laws in order to ensure that immigration and customs enforcement agents could take custody of a Guatemalan man accused of raping a child. He had to find a workaround because the system, as designed, would have let that man stay. These are not isolated incidents. They are a pattern of policy choices that consistently, repeatedly prioritize the interests and the freedom of people who have committed serious crimes over the safety and the rights of the people who were their victims and over the safety of future potential victims. And now, with these 4 bills, the pattern continues. Only this time the stakes are higher because we're not talking about bail. We're talking about the permanent sentences handed down to the worst criminals this state has ever prosecuted. Governor Kathy Hochul, for her part, has not commented publicly on these specific bills as of this reporting. Fox News Digital reached out to her office and had not received a response, which is itself a kind of answer. When bills this consequential are moving through your legislature, silence is a choice. Now, here's why this is not just a New York story, and it's not, even if it might feel like one. What happens in New York on criminal justice policy has a way of spreading. The state has been one of the leading laboratories for the kind of progressive criminal justice reform that has swept through cities and states across the country over the last decade. Bail reform, sanctuary policies, clean slate laws that seal criminal records. These ideas get piloted somewhere, they get packaged in language that sounds reasonable, and then they travel. The elder parole concept, for example, is directly modeled on California's approach. The New York version, critics warn, goes even further. And if it passes here, it will be cited as a model somewhere else. It will show up in another state legislature with a different name, but the same mechanics. So what you're watching in Albany right now is not just a fight over the fate of Joel Rifkin and Peyton Gendron. It's a fight over the direction of criminal justice policy in America, over what we believe sentences mean, over whether life without parole is a legitimate tool that a just society can use for its most irredeemable offenders, over who the system is actually built to serve. And the answer to that last question, right now in New York, seems increasingly clear. I want to end on something that I think gets lost in the legislative details and the political back and forth, because at the core of all of this is a question about what we believe justice is for. There are 2 competing visions of the criminal justice system in this debate, and they are genuinely incompatible. One vision says that the primary purpose of the system is rehabilitation, that people who commit crimes, even terrible crimes, are capable of change, that the goal should be to return them to society as better people, and that long sentences and permanent incarceration represent a failure of that mission. Under this vision, every prisoner is a candidate for release eventually, because every human being has the potential for redemption. The other vision says that the primary purpose of the system is justice, which includes punishment, public safety, and the protection of victims. That when someone commits an act of such extraordinary violence that 12 jurors unanimously decide they should spend the rest of their life behind bars, that decision was made correctly and should be honored. Under this vision, life without parole is not a failure of the system. It is the system working exactly as intended for the people it was designed for. These bills represent a clear choice in favor of the first vision, and they make that choice unilaterally, without asking the victims, without asking the families, without asking the communities that were shattered by these crimes. Suffolk County District Attorney Tierney captured the stakes with the kind of directness that politicians rarely use, and that I think deserves to be the final word from the people fighting these bills. We're talking about the worst of the worst, he said. The people who have done really the worst acts possible and have proven to be really a danger to our society. And they're like an infinitesimal small percentage of our population who create an inordinately large amount of all of the problems, all the violence, all of the theft and everything else. An infinitesimal percentage of the population creating an inordinately large amount of the harm. That is who these bills protect. That is whose interests Albany is currently debating how best to serve. And Teresa Bliss, standing at a podium asking whether her pain means anything, is still waiting for an answer. So here is where we are. New York State is considering 4 bills: the Earned Time Act, the Fair and Timely Parole Act, the Elder Parole Bill, and the Second Look Act, that together could fundamentally transform who stays in prison and who gets to walk out. Serial killers, mass shooters, cop killers, rapists, all potentially eligible, all potentially free. The bills are being pushed under the banner of reform. The language is compassionate. The titles are designed to make you feel like you're watching justice be done. But justice for whom? Not for the 9, possibly 17 women Joel Rifkin murdered. Not for the 10 people who just went to the grocery store and never came home. Not for the 6 commuters who died on a train. Not for David Bliss, who was 25 years old and whose killer was caught on camera laughing. And not for the families of any of them who were promised that the system would hold the people who destroyed their lives accountable, and who are now watching those promises be quietly, bureaucratically rewritten. This is the conversation that New York needs to have, out loud, publicly, with victims at the table, not just advocates for the people who victimize them. And this is exactly the kind of story that National Briefing exists to tell, because you deserve to know what is being done in your name, with your tax dollars, in the system that is supposed to protect you. If this video opened your eyes, share it with someone who needs to see it. Put it in front of the people in your life who think criminal justice reform is always a good thing, no matter what it actually says. Let them hear the name Teresa Bliss. Let them sit with the question she asked. Does our pain mean anything to you? Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think. Do these bills deserve to pass? Is there a version of reform that actually works for everyone, including victims? I read every comment. I want to hear where you stand. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. Hit the bell so you get every video the moment it drops, because we are going to keep following this story. We're going to watch what Albany does. And if these bills move forward, you are going to be the first to know. Stay informed, stay engaged. This is National Briefing, and I'll see you in the next one.